Hi and welcome back to the Gemhawks YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day and I hope you're having lovely warm summery thoughts today, no matter where you are or what time of year you're watching this. Today I'm going to be looking at some beads from a Jessie James beads collection. They released beautiful box sets of summer fun and this was Shark Week. I'll show you the beads in just a second that you get in the box, but what I want to share with you today in terms of a technique is to create a very funky little shark. That's actually, this shape is inspired entirely by one of the beads that you get in the box, which I'll just show you quickly now, which is this little one, which is very, very cool indeed. So if you'd like to join me down at the board, I will show you a little bit further about how we're going to do that. I'm going to be working with 1mm, which is 18 gauge, and 0.4mm, which is 26 gauge wires today. So these are the designs which we're going to learn to create today. Now I've made these two in slightly different sizes. If you wanted them to match as earrings, if you don't get them completely exactly the same, don't worry, because by the time they're on the other side of your head from the other one, it won't matter in the slightest. So I'm working today with 1mm, which is 18 gauge, and then this little bit of weaving, which is 0.4mm or 26. Now you could size that up to 0.5mm, which is 24 gauge if you like, but I do want to show you very quickly the beads that we're going to look at. So this is the Summer Fun Shark Week collection. And there are some standout pieces in here. There's these lovely large disc beads, which actually inspired the design we're going to work with. These are absolutely magnificent. They have some of the colours of Larimar. Obviously this is a man-made bead, but I adore the effect on these. The other ones, and I'm hoping that my camera is going to show it, are these. I mean, look at that. This again is a man-made bead, but the light interaction on them, they truly are miraculous. I love these so, so much. You're also getting a couple of the, I want to say pelicans. I'm not an ornithologist. And then some sea turtles, which are absolutely beautiful. That's the underside, that's the face. And I made this little stretchy in this design, and I haven't taken it off since I put it on. Very, very beautiful piece indeed. Love these beads. So I'm not going to go through each and every one. You do get some heavy saucer spacers. They're very, very cool and really beautifully made, actually. You've got bead caps. You've got some massively sparkly, this is a couple of cool cube beads. You've got some large bicones, a couple of puffy squares. These are exceptional. And a hammerhead shark pair as well. So I'm not going to go on and on about those because you can get that and see that for yourself. I'm just going to pop those back in the box and we'll work on the wire part of today's demonstration. But I cannot recommend that enough. The beads are absolutely stunning, and the components also really, really lovely quality. So I'm just going to pop that to one side and we'll take a closer look at these pieces here. So as I say, these haven't been made exactly the same size. You can play around with the form and the shape as exactly as you would like to. There's no limit to the variety of sharks you can make as well. So you've got these little hammerheads you could be inspired to recreate as well. They're very, very cool. I'm not a shark expert either, so I don't know quite what kind of sharks these are. They just look like sharks to me. So, you know, as I say, not an expert. I'm going to be working in two different colours of wire because I hope that it will enable you to see the weaving part quite clearly. My first section of wire is around 12 to 14 inches in length. This is 18 gauge or 1mm gauge wire that I'm working with. And the first thing I do when I cut that away is just use the flush side of my cutters to make sure that both of those ends are as neat as possible. You can obviously add in your burr cup tool to just round those ends off if you'd like to, but we will need to trim one of those ends a little bit later as well. It's just for your safety. Make that nice and smooth before you start working. So what I'm going to do is just grab hold of the end of the wire here and run that between thumb and forefinger to get that nice and warm. If you're respectful of your wire, it will be respectful of you. And if you treat it in a really delicate way to begin with, it will actually do quite miraculous things for you. So that's like 3 or 4 times maybe that I've just run thumb and forefinger over the wire to get some nice warmth and smoothness into it. If there are any little kinks on the end, if you feel better about getting rid of those, we do have a couple of contingency measures. So 12 to 14 inches is quite a generous amount. And that's because sometimes when you unspool the wire, you do get little marks and bits and pieces on there that you don't see when you're measuring. So you've got a bit of space to cut that away. So what we're going to do is start by creating the back of the shark. I'm going to go up and over in this direction. So what I would do is I would switch to my dominant hand, which is right, and I just apply a little extra heat to get that first nice little bend in the wire. So I'm not going to make this terribly small today, just because it's easier to show you, but you can make this literally any size that you want to. So what I might do is just pop that one up in the other corner so I can refer to it without knocking it over. I'm going to draw the wire around to create that nice, almost like a little hill, and then a gentle slope coming down before we create our first of those. I think they're called pectoral fins, but like I say, I'm not a shark expert. And what we're going to do is, before we make that bend, we're going to come down further than where we started. So if I put the start line on this small line in my board, I'm going to come a little bit further down. So I need a greater bend here, or we'll end up with a huge shark. So I'm just going to come a little bit past there, maybe 1/4 of an inch past that start point. And what I'm going to do is put my pliers underneath. I'm using my bent chain nose pliers today, and create a really sharp angle coming up and away. If that doesn't become sharp the first time, what you can do is offer those pliers back in and give that a bit of a just forwards and backwards motion, not too much, but just to make a nice sharp angle there. And you can straighten the back of the shark as well, just give that a nice bit of form. So we've got quite a decent V going on, and I want the long tail of the wire to come a little bit more southerly before I put the tip on that fin. I'm going to draw that around little by little so that I can control the shape and the size before I decide that that's exactly the size that I'm looking for. That looks pretty reasonable to me. Looks quite like a large piece. Like I say, perhaps if you're making earrings, then you would want to size this down a little bit. And I'm going to, as I say, put a little bit of firmness in that wire just by opening and closing the pliers, and making sure that I'm happy with the tightness of that angle on the end of the fin. So what I want to do is imagine the line of the back is continuing on down, and that's where I want my angle to come out. So it's very easy to put that a little bit too high or a little bit too low. So we want that to be as if the back body was continuing, and what we're looking at is a protrusion. And as I say, a little bit of forwards and backwards, and what you can do is generate a much sharper bend by moving that a couple of times, and you can re-straighten down here. So we're only going to come a very small distance, maybe even just 1/8 of an inch, before we start bringing that round to form the nose of our shark. So what I'm going to do is hold on to the section that we've just created, and then push that bit of wire around so that there's a definitive bend, but it's not going to be sharp like these other bends we've created. If you find that that fin isn't as sharp on the tip as you'd like it to be, you need to support the whole of the fin, turn your pliers over, and just give that very, very gentle, small movements to pull that more firmly in together. So what we're going to do now is continue with that nose. Just going to stroke the wire around to get that nice and warm, and bring that down to create the nose of the shark. I like to think of it as a nose. I don't know what it's actually called. It's where its mouth is. So I'm going to open and close that just 2 or 3 times until I get quite a nice point on it. It doesn't need to be super pointy, just nice enough. And then what we're going to do is come back up the same distance as we've come from our first very gentle little angle down to the point. We're going to try and replicate that on the other side. So quite a gentle angle here, and then that 1/8 of an inch or so before we pull out to the side to generate quite a sharp bend to create that other fin. So I think the dorsal's the one on the back and the pectoral's the one on the side. I genuinely don't know. So I'm going to try and replicate the size of the fin that we started with over here. Draw the wire back around, and then work on sharpening up. So what it's smart to do is get your angles in. So I'm going to push the wire out, so it's going to continue round to create the tail in just a moment. And once I'm happy with the positioning just here of the continuance of the body, if you make an error, what you can do is just very gently roll that round and then re-sharpen the angle. So I'm going to just put a little bit of a point on the tip of that one, and it is all about gentle movements before I give that a squeeze in the flat. Now with this design, what I would tend to say is that you're always working in 2 dimensions until you get to the hanging loop. Now, if you're putting a hanging wall art up and you want it to be flat, you can absolutely continue in the same direction, so it's completely flat, as if the whole thing is squashed between 2 panes of glass. But if you want to wear it as jewellery, you will want to have that hanging loop at 90 degrees, and I will absolutely show you that in a couple of minutes. We'll get on to that when we finish the end of our shark shape. So we're going to keep the design in the flat, and what I'm going to do is just sharpen up this angle slightly by drawing that further than I want it to go and then bringing it back into position. And if you do find that you've kinked the wire slightly by making that manoeuvre, you can just straighten that up between the 2 sides of your pliers. I'm just going to pop that back down, bringing my pliers flat and parallel to the desk so that I can just keep this as straight as possible. So the next thing I need to do is bring this up to give our shark a bit of a waist. Don't know if sharks have waists, not entirely sure. If I flip that over to replicate the design that we have just here, you'll see that it comes up before it very, very sharply bends back down towards that tail. So if it's easier, I can work in this orientation. So we've got a little bit of a coming upwards before we come back in. I'm going to go from underneath so you can see as much as possible. I've got my bent chain nose pliers and I'm going to just pop them up here. Now, if the shark was on the same orientation as the demonstration piece here, we've come past where that fin is, and we're probably about 2/3 of the distance from the nose to the first back bend where we started off in the beginning. So it's around about 2/3 of the distance, and then we're going to bring the wire back down. Now, I don't want this to be super sharp, but I want it to be a definitive bend, like so. And again, you need to keep these as if they're between 2 panes of glass. It's completely flat all the time, so if you put it down, there shouldn't be much variance in the wire coming away from the desk. So as that comes back down, I actually quite like that shape because it's reasonable to imagine that a shark body could do that. We're going to come down to approximately where I'm going to call this the armpit of the shark. I realise that's not what it is. I realise that these aren't arms, but I'm anthropomorphizing this shark so that I can tell you where I mean. So I'm going to put the pliers in opposite to the shark's armpit. I think that's be a great band name actually, Shark's Armpit. And I'm going to push that wire back a little bit. It's not a super sharp bend again, but it's a very definite angle change. And then we're going to pop these tail, I don't know if it's called a fluke, it's called a fluke in a whale. So we're going to put the tail on the shark now. So that's quite a firm angle coming back, but not quite as sharp perhaps as the fins are. And then I'm going to imagine that this is where the tail crosses at the back here. So I need to come up beneath the crossing point to create the second part of that tail. And we'll make this a little bit finer in just a second. So I want those 2 tail sections to be the same kind of size. And I'm going to bring that up. So what I need to do now is get the point between those 2 end sections a little bit sharper. So I'm going to just draw that open and closed a couple of times, and then coming from underneath, I'm going to just squeeze very, very gently, very, very gently. If you go too firmly, what can happen is that the wire will twist and you'll end up with one side higher than the other, and we're trying to avoid that. So what we need to do now is just get the angles looking aesthetically as you can imagine them to be. So again, if you've deformed the wire slightly, you can just pop the pliers in there and get that to look how you want it to. I'm not going to make these super pointy, but you could make them sharper if you'd like to. It's your shark, you can do as you please. So where that first bend for the tail is, I'm going to try and replicate that and bring that wire out slightly. What I'm going to do is bring it out further than I need, because what we need to do now is bring that back around, get the wire up here nice and warm, and then flip the wire around without losing the sharpness of that angle so that it sits over the top of that first back section. Now, if you feel that there's too much back up here, because we warmed our wire so beautifully, we can just turn this around until it sits exactly where you want it to sit. If you want to add a little bit more warmth, you absolutely can. I'm just going to give that a couple of little moments where I'm straightening it from 2 directions, drawing that down into position, and then as I draw the long residue tail of wire over the top, it's going to start looking right. It'll just look right. So for me, I think what I need to do is draw these 2 tail sections a little bit closer together so that I can get that angle just right. Like I say, I'm not an expert on sharks. And then I'm going to curl this back bit in ever so slightly so that this can come up and around. It's looking a bit more like the tail of a mermaid at the moment, so I'm just going to fiddle with that until it makes me happy. And then what I'm going to do, once I'm pleased with the overall shape, I think maybe that needs to just go a little bit further around. When I'm pleased with the overall shape, what I need to do is pinch the end where we started very, very tightly and draw the tail of the wire, not the tail of the shark, up and around to a balance point. Now, the central balance is actually quite tricky to find. You could try and see whereabouts that balance point is, but because you've still got so much of a residue here, it's going to pull that out of true. So in my experience, it's around about just above where the bend in the shark is. So I'm going to turn a right angle on the residue of wire up and away, like so. And I want that to be a super sharp angle. So I'm going to take that past where I need it to be and then draw it back into position and then push that down so that it replicates the shape of the original part of the shark underneath. So what I'm looking for really is for you to be happy with the shark shape. You can use this to create any shape that you like. If you go to your favourite internet browser and search for line drawings or wire drawings, you can find lots and lots of free images which show you interesting and varied line drawings of whatever you fancy. It could be a volcano, it could be a palm tree. The technique for this is going to be exactly the same, but utilising those free resources on the internet will enable you to kind of find your own flow, and you can then create pretty much anything you want that you can be inspired by. So we're going to continue with our shark now, and I'll show you how to make that wrapped loop for hanging. Like I say, you can make them for earrings or whatever you fancy. So what I'm going to do now is show you how to make a wrapped loop from which you can hang your shark form. I'm going to show you that in 90 degrees opposition to the shape of your shark. So your shark is on the flat like so, and the loop is 90 degrees opposite. And that's because when you pop that onto a chain or whatever to hang it around your neck or from the earrings, you may want it to sit flat like so. If you are going to make this to hang on a wall, you may prefer to keep that loop in the same orientation as the shark itself. It's entirely up to you. So if we're going to go for 90 degrees opposite, I will bring the pliers in like so. I'm going to take them maybe a 1/4 of an inch, maybe an 1/8 of an inch up. Let's have a look. Yeah, more like an 1/8 of an inch up from that final bend. I'm going to draw that wire forwards. I'm then going to pop in with my round bail making pliers. These are 6-step bail makers. And I'm going to probably use number 4. That's quite a useful size for making a general bail. I create that half moon shape first by rolling the bail makers into position, and then I'll take the tail of the wire all the way around to finish off. If I remove those bail makers, you can see it's a reasonably good round form. You can obviously take a little bit more time to get that perfect. What I'm doing here is I'm using the flat surfaces of my bent chain nose pliers to work harden that loop shape. I'm not pressing down anywhere 2 wires cross over. I'm only pressing down where a single strand of wire occurs. So I'm going to take this tail of wire and I'm going to wrap it all the way around that neck that we've created. So my hand gets in the way a little bit at some point. What I can do is flip the pliers if you prefer, so you can see the whole of that process. Take the tail all the way around. Try to keep that nice and flat. Flip it over And then I'm just going to take the tail. I'm currently working with raw copper wire, which is super, super soft. If you're going to wear this as jewellery, you probably don't want to go for anything less than an 18 gauge wire. However, if you're practicing and you want to practice shape making, you absolutely can use a slightly lighter gauge of wire. If it's for wall art, it will probably last quite nicely anyway, but jewellery, you will definitely want to keep it 18, 16, maybe even 14 gauge once you get to grip with forming those shapes. So I'm just going to fill the neck that we've just created up to the loop, and then I'm going to trim away that excess. Make sure that you cut the correct wire. We only want to cut the excess away. We don't want to cut the shark or jump the shark. So I've only got a little bit of wastage that's going in my scrap pot. And then you've got this little tail which we need to tuck away like so. Small movements, and just get that to sit super neatly into the design so you can hide that away. And where that ends is often what dictates which direction you want to view your shark in. So I'm actually quite pleased with that shape, despite it being made in one shot. I obviously spent a little bit more time on these, just getting them perfect. What I'm going to do now is bring in my slightly finer gauge wire, and I'm going to use, let me just have a look, it comes on a big reel. This is a German style 26 gauge or 0.4 millimeter. I'm going to take again around about the 12 inches or so. And that should be more than plenty to bring this design together. When I am working at weaving two sections of wire together, which is what we're looking to achieve here, I will often start halfway along the design, like so, halfway along the area that we want to fill. And what we want to do is we need to connect all of the section from here to here. And you can have a little bit going either side if you'd like to. So I would probably go about halfway along my finer gauge of wire and just draw that maybe a third in. So around about here, I'm just going to pop that over the top. I'm going to take the tail, I'm going to take it around the outside of the shark shape, up inside the shark shape. And what I want to do is for this to wrap 3 times around just the outer section of the back there. So that's 1, that's 2, that's a third time visually. So after that, in both directions, I'm going to go for 3 times around the upper of those 2 strands of heavier wire, and then once around both of them. It's just a 3 and 1 weave. It is very, very simple. It's not complicated. I will just tidy that little loop up there slightly. So I'm going to bring the tail of the wire up inside the shark shape, draw that around once, and then I'm going to wrap 3 times again just around the upper of those 2 strands of wire. So that's 1, that's 2. Now there are 2 techniques for wrapping like this. You can see here I'm pushing the next section of wire up and then drawing the tail through, and then I'm pushing the loop against the next loop. And then I'm going to wrap once more around both of those all the way over. Your other alternative is to take the end of that finer gauge wire and push that up inside. It's entirely up to you. If you're going to use this process, what you'll find is your wire will work harden more quickly. So as long as you put it exactly where you want it to go, that's no problem. Now, once you get towards the end of this section of wire, you want to just wrap around the outside only. If you get too close to the end and a slip occurs, this little wrap around both of those sections will fall off. And it can look a little bit unneat, a little bit messy. So I'm just going to continue all the way along to the end there, like so. And I'm just going to use whatever wire I have left over. Remember, we started halfway along the finer gauge wire and about a third of the way up from this little cut end here. So ideally, I'd like to fill as much of this as possible because it keeps the shape static. So basically now I'm just going to talk about wire and the types of wire that you can use. You can find, obviously you've got the different gauges, you've got different coatings on your wire. Some are non-tarnish, some are tarnish resistant, and then you've got raw copper. Now raw copper will patinate all by itself, just from the nature of you wearing it and touching it with your fingers. Some people, like myself, have specific oils in their makeup, which means that the wire will patinate quite quickly. You can speed that along with, there are a couple of different products on the market. The one that I'm familiar with is liver of sulfur, and that will darken the wire, which you can then neutralize and polish out, or you can just allow that to continue naturally oxidizing or creating a slightly darker patina over the surface. When you get towards the end of your wrapping wire, what I tend to do is switch to some pliers, and I'm going to slow that down slightly and pushing up against each time I make a little loop so that the coil I'm generating looks as neat as I can possibly make it. So you may find that this last little bit of wire gets a little bit tired and it doesn't necessarily want to last, in which case it may snap, or you may need to cut it away if it starts looking a little bit ragged. So I'm going to show you how to get that end tucked away neatly. I mean, you can continue to do that with your fingers as much as you like, but it can get a tiny bit stabby. So that very, very last little bit, I'm going to chase. It's coming up inside the shark frame, up and over the top. So I'm going to chase my pliers around in that direction, and that very, very neatly, very, very smoothly tucks that end away. Now, if you get too close to the end of the cut section, what can happen is the frame will move about slightly because we're not completely sealed yet, and you could possibly pull this section of wire out and it just looks a little bit messy. I'm going to flip the design over now because I'm right dominant. It's easier for me to wrap in this direction. Now, the beauty of a 3-in-1 wrap is that it is symmetrical front and back. So it's really down to how neatly you've wrapped the neck as to which orientation. Now, this section of the weaving, because we've got an open end here, you can very gently open this up and it's so much quicker. We've got 1, we've got 2, we've got 3. Push that through, tighten up the coils, and then again 1. I've just opened that up a little bit more than I wanted to, but there you go. 3. We can get that to sit back in just a moment. So I'm going to continue to show you this all the way through to the end. 1 and 2 and 3. Your wires also come in plated metals. A lot of the wires that I work with, like the one that is the finer gauge, 26 gauge. This is silver on copper. It's a fairly middle strength. It is neither incredibly springy nor is it incredibly soft. For me, it's what I'm used to, and it makes, I really enjoy working with it. So your German style, you could at this stage be using 0.5mm, which is equivalent to 24 gauge, and you'll just end up with a slightly more heavy look, as it were. So the wire is starting to get a little bit tense, and what can happen is it gets a tad baggy. So we're just going to push that up neatly. You do need to have a good pinching hand. If you struggle with that, you can get yourself a ring device, which I've just lost. I'm sure I had that there earlier. It's a ring clamp, which you can just squeeze down over this section, and it can make your life slightly easier if you're struggling with that grip. For short periods of weaving, as we're doing today with our Shark Week Shark, it shouldn't be too tricky. But if you do find that tricky, ring clamps are really very affordable and very, very useful. I don't tend to set faceted gemstones in rings. I tend to weave them into rings. So for me, I've actually never used my ring clamp for clamping a ring. That's 1 and 2 and 3. Now, when you get to the end of your infill section, you've got some choices. You could replicate what's happened here, which I think is what I'm going to do. I may be able to get one more double wrap in there. So I'm just going to squeeze that up as tightly as I can. I'm going to pull that tail over the top and into position. Now, that doesn't look too pretty to me, so I think I'm just going to switch to single wrapping around the back of the shark. What this will do is just tie everything neatly into position, and you'll find that this slips less once you have used both of those end sections of wire. So I'm just going to chase that around quite rapidly now until I get towards the end, and I can tighten that up and then push that out of the way. Just going to put the pliers in the opposite direction. That can sometimes just be all it takes to make something slightly less tricky. So there is your shark. Let's have a closer look up here. So I hope you've enjoyed creating the shark with me today. He's lots and lots of fun. I know some people are much more fond of sharks than others. I think they're super cool. Thank you so much for continuing to support me here on YouTube, and I look forward to seeing you again very, very soon. Do take care. Bye for now.